Hi everyone, today my team and I from Untitled shall be presenting Canada from a business perspective to you. I am Choma Alekama. With me, my other presenter is Stephen Paramore. First, let's discuss a brief history and geography of Canada. Canada was first explored by the French in 1534 and later explored by the English in 1583. After several years, Canada was united in 1840 and became the province of Canada. It gained its self-governing entity from the British government in July 1867, which is also known as Canada Day. Canada is located in North America. It shares border with the US. It's the largest country in the world and the world's largest country that borders only one country. The largest city in Canada is Toronto. Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories. Now let's discuss the political system.
Canadians are quietly moving toward a political 180. Canada's 2015 federal election is on October 19th and could see a dramatic shift in not only the ruling party, but the country's relations worldwide. So we wanted to know, is Canada undergoing a political revolution? Well, it's important to note that Canada's government is similar but distinct from the United States. As a parliamentary democracy, they don't have a president, but they do have a prime minister and, technically, a queen. While the Prime Minister has no term limits, Canada's elected parliament is completely refreshed every 5 years. This 2015 election will see Canadians voting for a whole new House of Commons. 338 parliamentary seats are up for grabs. The party that wins the most seats gets to select the country's Prime Minister and is known as the governing party. The one that gets the second most members is the opposition party. This effectively allows Canadians to vote in both their head of government and their parliament at the same time. Unlike the United States' two-party dominated system, Canada enjoys a wide variety of parties, with 3 major and 4 minor ones in the most recent
Overall, Canada is a political free country in which everyone has the right to vote and speak, just like the US. Canada is also relatively politically stable with a high rule of law. Canadians tend to obey their laws more compared to the US.
Over the past few decades, there has been very little corruption in Canada. As we take a look at the corruption score over time, we see that in 1995, Canada scored an 89 compared to the US at a 78. Corruption stays at a fairly similar level for both countries, as we see the most recent score here in 2014, where Canada is at an 81 and the US is at a 74. Here we take a look at Canada compared to its NAFTA member nations. As you see, Canada scored an 81, while the US scored a 74, and you see that Mexico scored a 35. Therefore, Canada is the least corrupt of its NAFTA member nations.
Next, I'll discuss the economic system in Canada. Today, Canada closely resembles the US in its market-oriented economic system and pattern of production. As of February 2013, Canada's national unemployment stood at a rate of 6.9%. And the economy continues to recover from the effects of financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. Canada's robust economic freedom rests on its judiciary system with impeccable records of interdependency and transparency. The government prosecutes corruption vigorously. Private property is well protected. In 2014, the Supreme Court for the first time confirmed an indigenous land title. Enforcement of contract is very secured and exploitation is highly unusual. Protection of intellectual property is consistent with world standards. Canada today is more economic free compared to the US, which started in 2008 with a score of 79, while the US has a score of 76.2. It's the 6th freest country in the world. Although in the past 5 years, economic freedom has declined due to increased level of corruption, it's still better than the US. Canada has free healthcare with a ranking number of 8 in the world and an index of 0.902 in HDI. It has a high life expectancy. Regarding commodities, mining is the most important to Canada because of its abundance in natural resources. Canada is the world's largest producer of zinc and many more. In the case of degradation of zinc and gold and many more, it leads the country and ranks the 3rd. About 80% of exploited resources are exported, mainly to the US, even though only 80% of its land is used for agriculture. Canada is one of the largest exporters of agriculture. Canada has a fairly high export rate of 31% of its GDP and 32% of its GDP which is imported, compared to the US which is 31% export of its GDP and 18% import of its GDP. The US accounts for nearly one-third of the overall gain in Canada's FDI. Europe remains the second most popular investment destination for Canadian direct investors. Canada gets a grade C on Outward FDI Performance Index and ranks 10th amongst compared countries. Despite this, it has a low GDP per current US dollar, which has increased by 2% since 2013. It has a high gross national income, but still lower than the US, but not by that much. Both GNI and GDP has increased significantly over the years in Canada. As of 2014, Canada has an inflation rate on consumer price of 1%, which is pretty much steady. It has a high inflation rate compared to the US of 1.6%. It got its highest inflation rate in 1981, in which the inflation rate was about 12%. Along with the US, Canada is negotiating a Trans-Pacific Partnership among 12 nations of the Asian Pacific. Canada, along with Mexico, has joined this negotiation in July 2014 after intensive bilateral talks with other TPP members designed to assess Canada's willing to negotiate an ambitious and high-standard agreement. While the negotiation remains confidential, several nations, including Australia, New Zealand, and the US, are seeking great access to Canada's supply management restricted dairy and poultry sector. Since 2008, Canada has conducted free trading agreements with no less than 39 countries, bringing a total of 44, making up more than half of the global economy and representing nearly one-quarter of the world's countries. Canada's financial institution consists of banks and credit unions. It has a total reserves, including gold, of $74 billion, while the US has a total reserves of $434 billion. Canada has a floating exchange rate regime in which the currency is set by foreign exchange market through supply and demand. After the Second World War, Canada became the first major country to adopt this floating regime. Canada uses the Canadian dollar. It has a 0.0% volatility to the US dollar. $1 is equivalent to 1.328 Canadian dollars. Now, Stephen will talk about the cultural aspect of Canada.
So I live in Canada, and as a Canadian, one thing I find is that people get us confused with Americans. A lot.
But aren't Canada and America basically the same country?
No.
Contrary to this man's opinion, when we take a look at some of the cultural variables such as Hofstadtes and Trompenaars, you can see that Canada and the United States are very similar in many of these cultural variables. The largest difference comes in internal versus external of Trompenaars, where Canada scores a 42 and the US scores an 82, which means Canadians are much more externally natured. Another set of cultural variables that we must consider is Hall's high versus low context and Hall's private space variables. Since there is no data for these variables, we know from his works that Canada, being a Western society, is a high context society where not everything needs to be said to be understood. This is the same as that of the US. Also, we know for the same reasons that Canada and the US have a high private space score, meaning they value their personal space more than cultures in, say, the Middle East. Another large aspect of culture is religion, and in Canada there are two main religious groups, Catholic and Protestant. Here in this pie chart you see that there are some other religions that occupy minimal amounts of citizens throughout Canada, but the bulk are divided between the Catholic and Protestant faith. Also, you can see here that there's a significant amount of Canadians who have no religious faith whatsoever, so one must be careful as to how it establishes its morals and value statements throughout the different parts of Canada. Language is another very important part of culture. Here are some statistics as to the languages spoken throughout Canada. English and French are the two major languages, and a business executive should take note to the amount of French-speaking Canadians in certain areas of Canada, such as Quebec. Literacy is another important aspect of culture in Canada. The latest literacy study done by Statistics Canada shows that millions of Canadians do not have the literacy skills they need to keep pace with the escalating demands of our society and economy. As you see here, 42% of Canadian adults have low literacy skills. This must tie into the low amount of patents produced, which we will discuss later. Next, we take a look at income distribution, where here we see a gradual climb in distributed income in Canada, where in 2006 the distributed income was $37,610, and in 2014 it was up to $51,690. Compare that to the United States, whose distributed income remained much steadier over time, increasing only from $48,000 to $55,000 over that same time span. Next, we will take a look at technology. Here in this image we see that the most recent survey from Conference Board shows Canada receiving a D grade for having only 20 patents per 1 million people in 2010. The US fared a bit better, receiving a C grade for having a little over 40 patents per million people. As we take a look at the next image, we see that for scientific articles, the most recent data comes from 2009, where Canada receives a B grade for having over 800 scientific articles per million, which is slightly better than that of the US, who received a C grade for having a little over 600 articles per million people. As we can see in the next image of R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP, we notice that the most recent information comes from 2012, where Canada has slightly less a percentage of GDP compared to the US, with Canada at a 1.8 and the US at a 2.9. Now I will talk a little bit about environment. Here you see the EPI index overall scores for Canada as well as the USA, as well as the scores for many important environmental areas. As you can see, the main differences in health impacts, Canada scores a 100 compared to the US score of 95.33. Although the numbers may not seem too far off, they are very much so, as Canada ranks first in this section. Canada ranks first in this section due to the outstanding healthcare system that they currently employ. In the next chart, you see that both Canada and the US see linear increases in their overall EPI score, with Canada going from 64 in 2005 to 73 in 2015. The same happens with the United States, where in 2005 they score 53 and in 2014 they score 67. Now I will talk a little bit about the legal system in Canada. When it comes to the Canadian justice system, their motto is the interests of society must always be balanced against the interests of individuals to see if limits on individual rights can be justified. Here you see the Canadian court system compared to that of the US. The US has a slightly more diverse court system than Canada, but both have the same basic principles from top to bottom. With this being said, the Canadian justice system is described to be unique in the world. It is said to be unique because the court resolves disputes, and in doing so, they interpret and establish the law for all Canadians. Also, the rights and freedoms in Canada revolve around the Constitution, as it does in the US. To protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, the Canadian Bill of Rights was passed in 1960. It was the first federal human rights law in Canada. It guarantees many of the same basic freedoms that we share here in the US. Now Stephanie will conclude with the SWOT analysis.
We perform a SWOT analysis on Canada to analyze its strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as a new market. Its strengths include an intelligent workforce, government support in growth and opportunities, public and private sectors partnership. Some of its weaknesses include outsourcing to Canada due to favorable exchange rates, no interstate commerce law for telecommunication. Its opportunities include high employment rate as Canada strives for continuous growth and opportunities. Some of its threats include the 9/11 attack, which has brought a new era in which previously limits has been abandoned. Also, some funds have been observed to be from traditional criminal activities. The main threat going on in Canada right now is its involvement in Afghanistan has increased threats to the Canadian troops. Thank you for listening and have a blessed day.